The Tower of the Drowned, Secrets of the Haunted Lighthouse. I first heard about the abandoned lighthouse from a coworker who insisted it was the creepiest place he'd ever visited. The locals call it the Tower of the Drowned, he told me one Friday over beers. No one goes there anymore. Too many stories. Too much history. Naturally, I was intrigued. I've always had a fascination with abandoned places, and the thought of exploring a derelict lighthouse sounded like the perfect adventure. My coworker tried to dissuade me, recounting tales of sailors' ghosts, strange lights at night, and the eerie sound of bells ringing in the fog. But the more he talked, the more I wanted to see it for myself. That's how I found myself standing at the edge of the rocky coastline one overcast Saturday morning, staring up at the towering silhouette of the lighthouse. It was even more imposing in person, a crumbling monolith that seemed to loom over the crashing waves. The air was thick with salt and the smell of seaweed, and the only sounds were the cries of gulls and the distant roar of the ocean. The hike up to the lighthouse was treacherous, the path narrow and littered with jagged rocks. As I climbed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was absurd, of course. There was no one else around for miles. But every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to find nothing there when I turned. When I finally reached the base of the lighthouse, I paused to catch my breath. The structure was even more decayed up close, its once white paint now peeling and weathered to a dull gray. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The interior was dark and damp, the air heavy with the smell of mold and brine. My flashlight illuminated the narrow spiral staircase that wound its way up to the top of the tower. The walls were covered in graffiti, most of it faded and illegible, but one word stood out: leave. I ignored the warning and began to climb. The staircase groaned under my weight, and I couldn't help but imagine it collapsing and sending me plummeting into the darkness below. As I ascended, I noticed strange markings scratched into the walls, symbols and patterns that didn't look like any graffiti I'd ever seen. They seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. About halfway up, I heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound that echoed through the tower. It was subtle at first, like the distant tolling of a bell, but it grew louder the higher I climbed. By the time I reached the top, the sound was deafening, reverberating through my chest like a heartbeat. I stepped onto the observation deck and the noise abruptly stopped. The view from the top was breathtaking. The ocean stretched out endlessly, the waves shimmering like liquid silver under the overcast sky. But my awe was short-lived. As I turned to look around, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Scattered across the deck were dozens of small, waterlogged shoes, children's shoes. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they had washed ashore during a storm, carried up here by someone as a macabre joke. But deep down, I knew there was no logical explanation. I decided it was time to leave. As I turned to head back down, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow flitting just beyond the edge of the deck. I froze, my heart pounding. Slowly, I moved my flashlight toward the edge, but there was nothing there, just the open air and the waves crashing far below. I started my descent, moving quickly but carefully. The oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of my own footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell. I was about halfway down when the door at the base of the lighthouse slammed shut with a deafening bang. I stopped in my tracks, gripping the railing for support. The air grew colder, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from above me. Panic set in as I realized there was no one else in the lighthouse. The footsteps grew louder, closer, as though someone was descending the stairs behind me. I didn't wait to find out who or what it was. I ran, practically throwing myself down the remaining steps. When I reached the bottom, I found the door locked. I yanked on the handle, my hands slick with sweat, but it wouldn't budge. The footsteps were almost upon me now, and I turned to face whatever was coming. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging the stairwell into darkness. And then I saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them, glowing faintly in the darkness, staring at me from the stairwell. They were too high, too far apart to belong to anything human. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was stumbling down the rocky path, the lighthouse growing smaller in the distance. I didn't stop until I reached my car, collapsing into the driver's seat and locking the doors. My hands were shaking so badly that it took several tries to start the engine. I drove home in a daze, replaying the events over and over in my mind. I considered telling someone what had happened, but I knew they wouldn't believe me. Hell, I wasn't even sure I believed myself. The nightmares started that night. Dreams of the lighthouse, of the children's shoes, of the eyes in the darkness. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, convinced I could still hear the tolling of that ghostly bell. It's been weeks now, and the nightmares haven't stopped. Sometimes late at night, I'll hear the faint sound of bells ringing in the distance, even though I'm miles away from the coast. And every now and then, I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that disappears the moment I turn my head. I don't know what I encountered at the lighthouse, and I'm not sure I want to. All I know is that it's not over. Whatever it was, it's still with me, watching, waiting.